We got another one of them, popping at the mouth or the side of his neck when he pouts. No argument, no rebuttal from. He ain't from my town, I don't know him, so I'm guessing he's a clown.
Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. This is your host, MagMongoSlade. Today, we're going to talk about the Janelle Grant Vince McMahon lawsuit, as Vince McMahon finally filed a motion. So, this is called the Defendant Vincent K. McMahon's Memorandum of Law in support of his motion to compel arbitration. So, Vince McMahon finally put out a civil document, basically saying that this is not the proper venue and that the NDA, which was signed by Janelle Grant, compels the parties to go to arbitration, as this is a civil matter and this is not a criminal matter anyway. So in it, however, he did make some arguments that might be interesting that we can actually compare to the things that was in the Janelle Grant lawsuit. Of course, he doesn't get into some of the meatier parts, some of the salacious stuff about pooping on somebody's head and the multiple rapes that occurred. He just flatly denies them. They don't go into any detail and try to counter them, however. But they do attack Janelle Grant's credibility. And the first couple of pages of that is pretty darn damning in terms of undercutting the Janelle Grant credibility claim. So in Janelle Grant's lawsuit on page 1, she says that she was dealing with profound grief and was struggling financially after, quote, devoting years to round-the-clock caregiving of her parents, that she was unemployed and that she had lost her parents' home in bankruptcy. Vince McMahon then said in his lawsuit that her father actually passed away in April of 2017, which was 2 years before the two of them ever even met, and that his marital status at the time of his passing was widowed, meaning that Janelle's mother had actually died before her father did. And this all came from the foreclosure proceeding where, Janelle's parents lost her home. That he also says that Janelle had her father living in a senior citizen's home and was not with her. So the idea that she was devoting years to round-the-clock caregiving is false, because her father was living in a senior citizen's home in Stanford before he passed away. And the idea that she was her parents' caregiver, and they countered this by saying that during the foreclosure, Janelle said she didn't want anything to do with it, meaning the foreclosure, meaning the house. She didn't want to try to save the house. In fact, on page 8 of Vince McMahon's document, it says, plaintiff was so absent in her parents' lives that it took substantial time and significant effort for the creditor in the action to locate her and identify her as her parents' next of kin. In other words, she was not that involved in her parents' home, as the creditors had to actually search for her in order to find her. And I guess when they actually did find her, she said she didn't want anything to do with this, which is not exactly two things that would, if you were round the clock taking care of your parents, it should have been fairly easy to find. And of course, you would want somebody. Maybe you don't have the money to save the house yourself, but you would be more involved in the bankruptcy. The big issue here is that Janelle Grant, throughout her entire lawsuit, is talking about how she was financially destitute, that she essentially was leaning on Vince and WWE for financial stability, and that without the job, she didn't have much of anything, which is, is going to bolster her argument that she was, I'm just a girl when it comes to, taking care of herself, and that she couldn't really do that. And Vince was able to dangle all of these promises over her head. But then it turns out that she actually had a multi-million-dollar boyfriend who lived in the same building as Vince. And this boyfriend is how she was able to take care of herself for all this time. Apparently, this boyfriend is an attorney and was her fiance for a long time. And this guy is a senior vice president at Televisia Univision, which is, I think, a television program network. And that she would leave his apartment and come 4 floors up to Vince McMahon's apartment in order to have sex. Sometimes even at about 2:30 in the morning. Now, of course, this cannot be verified, but it explains how somebody with no income and had not been doing anything with most of her life was able to have access to such rich and powerful man as Vince McMahon. Continuing with this, the Vince's attorneys said that, quote, defendant was never contacted by, I'm going to redact the boyfriend's name, anyone at the building, the police, any friends of plaintiff, or any lawyer or advocate of plaintiff at any time about the fictitious, extensive, years-long abusive behavior alleged by the complaint. So what Vince is saying is, we lived in the same building. You had a boyfriend in that building. Nobody ever said anything about these years-long complaint of you being abused, raped, shit on, all this kind of stuff. Nobody ever saw it. Nobody ever said anything. So basically just putting it into question, how could it be true that you were living with somebody and they never saw any of this stuff that you're talking about? Which is a valid question. It's not flatly put out there because they really want to get to the conversation about arbitration, but they have to counter some of the narratives. And they're showing you that some of the narratives that she had been lying about her background, that she had more money and a safety net. She was not completely and totally reliant on Vince McMahon because she had a rich boyfriend that she was living with. This also, of course, when Janelle says in her lawsuit that she engaged in sexual relations with Vince McMahon in May of 2019, she did so out of fear of negative consequences, basically that she wouldn't get the job. But she was already living in a multi-million-dollar condo provided to her by her boyfriend. So she didn't have to have sex with Vince because she already had somebody taking care of her. That's pretty damn important, for you to leave out of your documents. But you have to realize when you're trying to tug on somebody's heartstrings, saying that you're poor and destitute and you don't have anything is a good way of getting people's sympathy. If she was to be upfront in this lawsuit and say, well, I was living with a rich guy and, he was taking care of me, or at least letting me live with him, however she wants to put it. Her attorney did respond to this stuff through Post Wrestling and WrestleNomics. I'll get to that in 1 second. But if you would tell the people that, hey, my fiance is a senior vice president of a television network, well, then the idea that Vince McMahon dangling a job over your head, that kind of goes out of the window, because it's like, so what? You still bang the 70-year-old creepy old man when you didn't have to, because you could have just stayed with your maybe age-appropriate boyfriend, but you didn't do that. Instead, you went chasing waterfalls. Janelle Grant's attorney, Ann Callis, she said to Post Wrestling and WrestleNomics that Janelle Grant was not dating at the time, and that the boyfriend was actually an ex-boyfriend who was allowing her to live in the apartment so she could, quote, rebuild her life and resume, and that she had no job or no financial support. It's not realistic that this guy was just providing her with a multi-million-dollar apartment and absolutely no food and nothing else. How likely is that? Oh yeah, you can live in my house, but I'm not going to feed you. Oh yeah, you can live in my multi-million-dollar house, but, we're not going to buy you any clothes. I'm not going to look out for you at all. I'm just going to house you for months and months and months. Apparently for 3 years. She lived with this guy the entire time that they were, intertwined, her and Vince. So this, of course, destroys her credibility, because now her attorney is saying, well, yeah, she lived in the building. Okay, then you have the argument that she didn't have anything. She didn't have any money. She didn't have any opportunities. She could have went and worked for her boyfriend. He's a senior vice president of blah, 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 and blah, 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 blah. Why didn't she go work with him? I mean, you see how, something as simple as leaving out the fact that she was living with another guy leads you to an entire new branch of arguments, and more questions emerge. It's like, you didn't need to have sex with Vince McMahon. You have a rich boyfriend. You didn't need the job at WWE. You probably could have put a little bit of pressure on your rich boyfriend to give you a job. You didn't really need to do any of this stuff. It just happened, It's just, so you really start asking questions. And that's if you're being curious and you're not, trying to be biased in any way. And I'm admittedly somewhat biased, but for God's sakes, I criticize this document for not going after some of the substantive complaints about, the rapes and the text messages and stuff like that. But attacking her credibility is pretty damn good, because part of why people believe this thing is because of the setup that she was grieving about her parents. So you see people and they online and Vince says, well, your parents were dead for 2 years before I even met you. And then you see people online saying, oh, the grieving process, you never really get over, your parents passing away. It's like, yeah, that's true. But she was 40 some odd years old. And from what it sounds like, her parents were very old and sick. And she is already living with another guy already. I mean, come on. How destitute were you really? You was already living with somebody else. How down on your knees were you? You weren't out here hat in hand as you tried to get everybody to believe, because you were dating. You had a boyfriend, multimillionaire, lives in an apartment. You lived there with him. How bad off were you? You're mentally and emotionally scarred. I mean, maybe, but it's not like they died 2 weeks before you met Vince. They died 2 years before you met him. When it comes to the parents, and Callis responded that the father was in an in-home hospice during his last days, and Janelle cared for him round the clock, and that she had been caring for her blind, wheelchair-bound mom before she passed away too. Now the in-home hospice, that's likely. Maybe her father really did live in a senior citizen's home, and then maybe he was on his last days and they said, look, we're going to send him home for a couple of days and he's not going to finish out the week. And then he died 3 or 4 days later. Who knows? But in her lawsuit, she said that she was devoting years to round the clock caregiving. If he was living in a senior citizen's home, she was not providing years round the clock caregiving. He was in a senior citizen's home. Even if she was there in his last days, those were still 2 years before she met Vince, and it still wasn't round the clock caregiving. So you kind of have to ask the question, like, how much of this stuff do you really start to believe now? Because if she would lie about something like this, why wouldn't she be lying about, him shitting on her head? These are the kinds of questions that you would ask if you were curious. Later, Vince starts talking about, his attorney says that they decided to go back to their partners 3 years after their first entanglement, and that she agreed to a contract. And she even, he claims that she wanted a stipulation into the NDA that Vince can never leave the building, the apartment complex that they lived in. She wanted him to stay there as long as she was there, and that he flatly refused that. So that's, of course, we would have to see that. That sounds crazy, but it follows from the love letter. If you believe the love letter, and then you hear that, she didn't want Vince to ever leave this building that she lived in. How attached was she really to him? And that kind of speaks to that she was legitimately really attached to him. Now, of course, earlier in the filing, Vince McMahon and his attorneys argued that, quote, it would be incredulous that she would write such a love letter, the one that was posted in the New York Post, after all of these supposedly events had occurred. So again, she said she was being coerced into sex from the very beginning. from like 2019, from May 2019 till the writing of the letter, until 2022, she claimed every sexual encounter was coerced and that she was abused at every turn. And she still wrote this letter. Now, of course, we know her attorney claimed that she was coerced into writing the letter and that she plagiarized certain elements of the letter in order to pretty much get Vince out of her hair. She got tired of the old man asking about it. So she wrote the letters, and then she also said that these were intimidation tactics and all this sort of stuff, which of course doesn't make any sense. How is it an intimidation tactic to post what somebody wrote with their own hands? Seems pretty silly to me. So in Janelle Grant's lawsuit, she says in January 2022, Vince distanced himself from Janelle because Linda had learned of their relationship, and so it was off. At this point, Janelle and Vince started negotiating the NDA, where Janelle Grant claims that she wanted $3 million. Vince only wanted to give her $1 million. He then agreed to give her $3 million, but he wanted it broken up for, I think he says, some kind of financial purposes. So it was $500,000 a year for 4 years. So she was supposed to get $500,000 in February of 23, February of 24, February of 25, February 26. She's going to get $500,000 every single year in February. He also, this is according to her lawsuit, he gave her $10,000 for her attorneys as well. But she claimed that she was being pressured to sign the documents, and that Vince McMahon would question her attorney and led her to question the efficacy of her own attorney. And she started really kind of questioning whether her attorney was good or not. And Vince was criticizing the attorney for being a wordsmith. And he really wanted to get this thing done. So there was a lot of pressure on her throughout this entire time. And Vince basically just says, well, look, you signed it. You signed the document. And that she had a lawyer, and the lawyers negotiated the agreement, and she signed it. Then she claimed that Vince, in March of 2022, Vince's attorneys called. This is from Janelle Grant's lawsuit, and stating that there was an anonymous email floating around about the affairs, which include, of course, John Laurinaitis. And then in June and July 2022, this when the Wall Street Journal articles dropped, and then Janelle was not paid in February of 2023. Vince McMahon says that he found out that she violated the agreement, and that's why he stopped paying. And that if she wanted to continue this, quote, fictitious claim, she has to do so in arbitration and not in court. Then he also says that she can still call witnesses that will and have discovery and all the stuff that is normal for a regular trial, but it has to be done in arbitration. And that he's basically looking forward to doing that so that he can prove that she's a liar. So he's not running from the grind. He's not running from the case. He's just saying this is an improper venue. We agreed to do arbitration because that's in the NDA. But of course, she's arguing that the NDA is not valid. And that is, of course, a big chunk of Janelle Grant's lawsuit at the end, after all the salacious stuff about multicolored dildos. It is the claims that the NDA was a product of coercion, that the NDA is unenforceable, that it violates the Speak Out Act, that is too broad in terms of confidentiality, because she believes that through the wording, she cannot even tell people that she worked at WWE, which means she can't put it on her resume. And she felt like she didn't have enough time to negotiate, and that there were some terms that she preferred that are not in the document, such as Vince paying for her medical bills, her lawyers, etc. Vince claimed that the NDA that she signed, she agreed to waive any rights to bring any sort of legal actions against Vince McMahon or the WWE, and that throughout the entire scope of this agreement, all issues must go through arbitration. So what he's saying is, not only can you not sue me in court, you also cannot sue WWE. And even though John Laurinaitis is not a signatory on this, it should also apply to him as well. That was an interesting bit here. So they're saying, well, Vince is saying, all of these issues must go through arbitration. They should not go through court because of the documents that you signed. And they had mutually agreed to not sue each other. They had mutually agreed not to defame each other. And that there was a clause in the NDA that stated if any part of the agreement was unenforceable, that had to be determined by the arbitration panel. He also wants his $1 million back. So again, he's not running from the grind. He's basically saying, you breached the contract. I want my money back. And he says that she knowingly and voluntarily signed the NDA, and then she also violated the NDA. And if she felt like he had violated the NDA by not paying her, which is what she says in her lawsuit, that Vince breached the contract by not paying her the money, Vince says, well, if that was the case, you should have sued me in arbitration for breach of contract, not through the court with all of this, sex trafficking stuff. So that's pretty much the long and the short of it. Vince claims that Janelle seeks to void the NDA based on the Speak Out Act, but he doesn't believe that the Speak Out Act prohibits arbitration of any of the claims in this case, and that, the court can always issue a stay pending arbitration if they so desired. So if the court doesn't want to let go of this case, they can hold it, but they can also push for arbitration to handle this as is laid out in the NDA. And then if, nothing satisfactory comes out of that, they can always go back to court. But the argument here is Vince wants to argue venue. He wants to get control of this case. It seems that Ann Callis really wants to argue this thing in the media. She's doing a lot of media. She's basically got a through line directly to post wrestling and WrestleNomics. And of course, Vince is going to use whatever he can. That's why the New York Post ended up getting the love letter and all that kind of stuff. So this thing could quite possibly get ugly. But Vince says, hey, he's looking forward to bringing out all of the communications, which includes communications that she left out of her lawsuit, such as her replies to some of the text messages that Vince sent, or, emails that she may have written, other things like that. Also other maybe letters that she had written to him that she probably now regrets writing. But these sorts of things, this is it's almost like a divorce, that's how nasty this thing is. And this poor guy, this boyfriend, is now wrapped up in this thing. And it's kind of silly, it sucks for him. Now, as a little bit more of a background, it turns out that Janelle Grant was a actress, and that she claimed to have a law degree from Pace University, but she never took the bar exam. And that is why WWE HR asked her for the legal administrator coordinator position. So basically they're saying that she had some kind of background, or at least she alleged that she had a legal background, which is why she got put in the legal department. But in reality, she had spent several years working towards becoming an actress. So there's some questions, of course, about her background, but those things are not really relevant unless they contradict something that she actually said in her lawsuit. But are they saying that she lied about having a law degree? We don't know, but we do know that she went to school with one of Vince's personal trainers, and that she had a rich boyfriend who lived in the building. Those things are facts. They both agreed that they had a 3-year affair. She claims it was coercive from the very beginning, while Vince claims it was consensual and that at no time was there any mistreatment or abuse. He admitted to hiring her, and they were having sex while, she worked there. So that part is not in denial, but he is, of course, denying all of the sex trafficking and stuff like this. It just appears that the more information that comes out kind of makes Janelle Grant look bad, Because the love letters, you can say, oh, it was coerced, but how many of those things are there really? We don't know. And, you didn't mention that. You didn't mention having a rich boyfriend that lived in that building either. And not just, a rich boyfriend like he was a surfer dude living off of a trust fund. This guy was a corporate somebody at a television network. That's a pretty high powered guy. Like, he's not, multi-billionaire Vince McMahon, but most other women went and turned the other cheek on that guy, So all of this stuff, it really just kind of attacks her credibility. It hasn't countered her claim that she was abused, because how do you prove you didn't abuse anybody? That's always the case when you talk about these sexual assault things. How do you, unless you were physically not there at all, how do you prove you didn't do it? And then when people hate you, they just believe it happened because that's what they want to believe. And I'm in this situation where I'm looking at this thing and I'm saying, Vince's story, at least some of it, sounds far more realistic. She is a fairly young woman who was dating a guy, and maybe they were dating, maybe they were on and off. She's living in his apartment. She, finds this older gentleman, they start doing stuff. She becomes a little bit attached to him. He brings her to work with him, which was stupid on his part. He's taking care of her. She accepts all of these gifts. Who knows? She's writing him love letters. Maybe he's believing the crap that she's writing. Maybe she's writing these things, but she doesn't believe them at all. I mean, people do that all the time, right? They write poems for people. They don't really care about them. They tell people they love them all the time. They really don't. So we don't know what people's real feelings are. Vince is claiming that she didn't ever want him to leave that building. She's like, oh, he's a monster who was, passing me around to all of his friends. This is the kind of mudslinging that gets into these lawsuits. And we really just have to look at things that we can independently verify. And that's why I put so much towards what Vince is saying in this lawsuit, is because the foreclosure paperwork, that's independently verified. That's independent documents. This is not something Vince, dreamed up in his head. It's not an argument that he's making. Those are legal documents that were likely filed before he even met her that stated, X, Y, and Z. That disproves her narrative that she was taking care of her parents and, and all this stuff. If they can provide direct third-party evidence that she was not really taking care of her parents and that she really didn't want anything to do with her parents until maybe they got up to a certain point where the nursing home couldn't take care of them anymore, or maybe they ran out of money, or whatever the case may be, because the argument is she was destitute and down on her luck and made her susceptible to Vince McMahon's persuasions and manipulations. That's what she was saying. She said that stuff. All Vince is saying is you had a rich boyfriend that you were living with, and then the attorney and Callis says, well, technically, he might have been her ex-boyfriend. It's like, well, he was still living in his apartment. She's claiming that she had no job and no financial support. I mean, if the guy was taking care of her, then she wouldn't need a job. She's living in his apartment. What does she need a job for? That's my question. Like, what does she need a job for? You're already extremely high up on the food chain. He's already taking care of you. You would have to be naive to think that she was living in this guy's house and he wasn't feeding her, clothing her, fucking her, or something. Come on. Let's just be real. You have to stop treating people like angels. People are people, man. Maybe this guy knew that she was doing this stuff and he didn't care. Or maybe he didn't know. One way or the other, she left him completely out of her lawsuit because it counters the fact that she was susceptible to being manipulated, because it's not true. She wasn't as broke and down bad as she said. And this is something I'm really pushing because her attorney admitted it. Her attorney admitted that this thing was true, that she was living with the rich boyfriend. Come on. You know, what more can you say? Now we have to start asking some more serious questions about this whole Janelle Grant thing. But for right now, it's probably going to end up in arbitration, and there may be some information that slides from out of there. I'm pretty sure it's going to end up in arbitration, and it's probably going to end up being financial. And but he's still under federal investigation. We'll see how that goes. All right, like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later. Peace.
Skin tone, so why attach yourself and piggyback the wealth you didn't earn or lack yourself? I'm telling you to own up to your own success and failures. It's a reason why these